I came to Wagga in November 1952, and the priests here were Father Duck was the administrator, Father Josco, Father Stanley, and Father Cosgrave had just gone to Tarcutta and I took his place. I wasn't appointed as curate in the Cathedral until February 1953, and my area of responsibility was here in South Wagga with Father Josco. We were to prepare South Wagga to be a new parish. I had the west side of Trevor Street and he had the east side. And the school had just opened in February 53, St. Maria Goretti's School, with Sister Paul Macron as principal, Sister Elizabeth and Sister Veronica as her assistants, and Mrs. Lawson, who was one of the first lay teachers to be involved in a Catholic school.
When we first started up to school at Maria Goretti, Father O'Leary or Father Josco used to bring us to school. They'd say Mass at Mount Erin, and then after Mass they'd bring us to school. And we went home by bus mostly, except when Sister Elizabeth got a burst of energy and she'd say, let's walk home. But I wasn't a willing walker, so we only tried that a couple of times. That was the end of it. Father O'Leary is a great friend. He used to come practically every day and take a religion class for me. And I was very happy about that because, well, they were getting it first hand. And the children loved to see him coming too.
I'd just like to recall some of the memories I have of St Martha's Sewing Guild. And to do that we have to go right back to the Altar Society that we had at St Eugene's. Father Andrew Quinn was our spiritual director then, and he thought that it would be a good idea to get the women involved in something that was very close to the church, and he came up with the idea of us sewing the vestments. He had in mind the new church, Our Lady of Fatima church, that would be ours in a couple of years. And we had no money, so we had to get whatever we could from the Altar Society. Now, young people wouldn't know what an Altar Society was, but it just was a group of women who once a month went around a certain area in their town and collected money, mostly £1 a month, and that was used to pay for the candles or anything that was used on the altar. We paid for it out of this Altar Society money, and there was enough there for us to start the sewing group off. It was called St Martha's Sewing Group because we were supposed to be workers, and the first meeting was held at Nellie Brennan's, and she was to be the chief cutter-outer or designer for the vestments, and we had to get all our material from Sydney. You couldn't buy it here in Wagga. We had to buy it from church stores in Rawson Place in Sydney. They had everything that we needed, the material, the braids, the cottons, the motifs, everything. So after that first meeting, we had another one at Nellie's, and she had some of the pieces of the vestments cut out. We each took a piece home, and apparently we were all right, because when we brought it back next month, the group was formed and really got underway. Our next meeting was at Irene Pirtle's in Coleman Street. In fact, the next two meetings were held there, and then they were day meetings, and from there we came up to here in 90 Urana Street, and we used to have the meetings at night time. And there were three ladies, Irene Pirtle, Myrtle Ryan and Mary Mullins, who brought their sewing machines along. They were portable machines, and in this very room they did the sewing, and then we had Nellie doing the cutting out, and we had Biddy Hale and Flo Selms and Joan Quinn and Lorna Martin doing the handwork. Another member of our group was Irene Hogan. She was an expert crocheter, and she made all the cinctures that were used with the vestments. And I was the rouseabout. I just kept everybody going with the needles, cottons, threads, whatever they wanted. And we worked hard. Father Quinn decided he'd try and get some wedding dresses to make some of these vestments. There weren't very many that were suitable for sewing. We used one or two, I think, but other than that, we mainly used the stuff from the Sydney stores.
Bishop Henske had great devotion to Our Lady, and he declared 1953 the Rosary year, Rosary Crusade, to get every family in the diocese saying the family rosary every day. He commissioned Clary Watts to produce a special picture that people could sign as an indication that they were prepared to say the rosary every day. And the climax of the year was the 11th of October 1953, when we had a mass in the showgrounds at 12 noon in the presence of Cardinal Gilroy and Father Patrick Peyton, the great Rosary priest. There were 21,000 people at the Mass. The parishes were divided into groups representing a decade of the Rosary, and the Mass was at 12 noon, and those were the days when the priest saying the Mass had to be fasting from midnight. You weren't allowed even a drink of water. I, being the junior priest of the diocese, was the one who was chosen to say that midday Mass. Nobody at Holy Communion, just the Mass. Cardinal Gilroy preached and Father Peyton preached. And after that we had benediction in St. Mary's Yard, solemn benediction given by Bishop Henske, and it was a tremendous occasion. Father Des Lane was the priest who was designated to organize the diocese, and he did a magnificent job. Cardinal Gilroy blessed and opened the church on the 10th of October 1953, and that was the day after we had the famous Home of Compassion ball in Kiamba Smith Hall with the Cardinal in attendance.
The first Mass was said on the day of the opening, and Mrs. Joan Quinn laid the vestments out on the altar. In those days the bishop always put the robes on the altar. It was pretty bare at that time, and because we had no coverings at all on the floor, I took a couple of carpet runners that I had in my hall here up and put one in front of the altar and the other in front of the altar rails. And my niece, Kathy Kelland, was christened there on the Sunday, and there was no baptismal font there. That room wasn't finished, so we took a glass basin up for the holy water. And Mrs. Biddy Hale also brought a member of her family, a baby breed, up to be christened that same day.
Now the parish began on the 1st of February 1955 with Father Gallagher as parish priest and Father McGrath as the assistant. We had been given the impression by Bishop Henske that Father Josco would have been the first parish priest. And so he regarded himself as parish priest before 1955, and he did a lot of organisation in the parish, and I was supposed to be his helper, but I don't think he regarded me as much for help. He used to call me that damned Irishman. And he came from Poland. He was born in 1900. He fought in the First War in the cavalry in Poland, and then he was ordained. And when the Second World War came, he was a parish priest, and he had 3 or 4 curates in his parish. And he was a very well-renowned parish priest in his own diocese. But he was on the reserve and a reserve officer in the army, and so he was called up at the beginning of the war, and he had a very hair-raising trip through Europe to escape the Russians and the Germans, and he got to England. And there he was chaplain to the Polish Air Force all during the war, and he lived up in Scotland. One of the interesting things about him was he had an illuminated address given to him by the people of Old Kilpatrick in Glasgow, expressing their appreciation of the fact that he was the first priest to say Mass in that area since the Reformation. And he invited the local Catholics to come and attend Mass with the Polish soldiers, or Air Force. And they appreciated it very much. And he kept in contact with them all through his life when he came out here. But I was home in 1980, home in Ireland, and one of my classmates, Father John Tobin, had just built a church in Scotland, and it happened to be in Old Kilpatrick, where Father Josco had served so many years before. And in the booklet that he produced, he referred to the Polish chaplain who invited the people to attend Mass in his Army Air Force hut and expressed their appreciation of him. And there was actually a picture in the booklet of Father Josco with his Polish Air Force personnel. I showed it to him, gave it to him, and I never got it back, of course. But he didn't seem to appreciate it that much. He was over 80 at this stage, so it probably too much for him. He was a very soft, sentimental man. He appeared very hard, but he was far from it.
As far as I remember, Father Josco was welcome to our meeting sometime in 1951. And from then on, he took over, and we finished up making all sorts of things, not only the vestments, but the altar linen, the purifiers, even the linen cloths for the altar rails, which were in use then. And the cope, I embroidered the back of the cope and the humeral veil, and that's still in use today. And some of the tabernacle covers or veils are still being used. These vestments weren't easy to make. They were the old sandwich board type of things, and if you didn't have them exactly right, they just wouldn't hang properly. You had to get them exactly right for them to sit nicely on the priest. And they had miles and miles of braid all the way around and across the back, and crosses, pieces down the front, motifs on the back, and there was a lot of work involved in making them. And by the time the church opened in 1953, we had 3 sets completed. There was a red and a purple and a black.
We had a mission in October 1953, conducted by Father McGill, who is from the north of Ireland, the Redemptorists, and Father Creed, who was from the Republic of Ireland, from Carlow, where I went for the seminary I attended was in Carlow. And they conducted the mission, and beforehand they went round the streets with loudspeakers telling the people that the mission was on. And we got very good crowds, and everybody was very thrilled to see so many cars outside Our Lady of Fatima Church. And that was the beginning, I suppose, of the spirituality of the parish. We used to say Mass in the Our Lady of Fatima every morning in 1954, 55, 54, before it became a parish. We used to come from the Cathedral to say 7 o'clock Mass. We used to first Friday Masses with the kids, and Rosary and Benediction and all those things.
After Father Cal came, we were still sewing things, and he had us making all sorts of things for his Fatima festival on the 13th of October each year, particularly the one down in Lytton. We seem to have a lot of sewing to do for that. But the very last thing that we did was to sew all the curtains for the new parish house.
One of the happiest memories of my time as assistant in South Wagga was the day that the doorbell rang and I answered it, and this would have been only about 3 weeks after the parish began in February 55, and a young fellow called Kerry Fitzgerald, a younger brother of Father Tony and Father Ralph, presented me with a sheet of paper on which there were 25 names of young men. And he said, "Father," he said, "this is a list of the men who want to be a cathedral choir, and we want you to be its leader and conductor." And I suppose if I had asked the Lord of Love for a special gift to start off the parish life, nothing would have been more acceptable and welcome than that. Because whereas some priests get their relaxation in playing golf or tennis, others become rowers of boats, others find their relaxation in various avocations of one kind or another. The one that I found the most relaxing in my life as a young priest was being the trainer and conductor of a choir of young men. And the way it happened was we had been a choir, I and quite a few young priests with me and seminarians of Manly Day. We formed the liturgical choir for the ordination of Father Ralph Fitzgerald on the 10th of January 1955, and all of these young men were in the congregation and heard what a liturgical choir should be and could be, and they got together and said, well, we could do that, couldn't we? And they really did. And we went on together for 17 years, even long after I left the Cathedral of Wagga. I used to go in every Thursday night from the parish of Henty and continue the work of conducting the cathedral choir. We often went for Stedfords against various other great choirs from as far away as Cowra and Canberra. We even once gone second in Ballarat, which was one of the greatest tributes that we ever had. And I can remember Dickie Thew, who was the adjudicator in one of the greatest Stedfords in Wagga. After we made a mess of the church choir competition, we came back 2 nights later for the male choir competition. And he called me up to the stage and he said, "Young man, please forgive me, because it wasn't your fault that they made a mess 2 nights ago." But he said, "Tonight, I've never given 100 marks, how about 99 and a half?" And we relished the clapping and the joy that came from the State Theatre in the middle of the main street of Wagga, who had experienced what, to my mind, was one of the greatest male choir performances I ever heard. And the song we sang was a 4-part version of Waltzing Matilda. And that has stayed in my mind and in my heart ever since. I wasn't so happy with the wives of the young men, because when we went down to the cathedral, they were quite happy to release their young husbands to the priest for choir practice. And when they didn't get home often until midnight, they were very cross with this young priest who took their husbands from them and had them playing up long after choir practice time. But they, with me, have such happy memories of being St Michael's Cathedral choir, and for so long. I remember Bishop Henschke saying on one occasion, he said, "I never thought when it started that it would last a year." But he said, "I have to admit that I was wrong." And our greatest joy was, after midnight mass on Christmas Eve, he would come up to the choir gallery all the way just to say thank you.
The St Vincent de Paul Society started in Wagga, we think around about 1901, that's our first records, but it could have started before that, and the first conference was down at the Cathedral. Our conference at South Wagga actually started in about 1947, and the meetings were held at St Mary's School, and the name chosen was St Eugene's, which has a connection with, of course, the hall or the old church at chapel at Mount Marian. So in 1947 a conference was formed, and then it was received its certificate of aggregation in July of 1952. And the certificate of aggregation is a certificate that shows that you're a responsible conference, that you've been working for quite a while, you're established. And so our aggregation certificate is in July of 1952. Then in the late 70s, under the presidentship of Bill Fitzgerald, from the President of New South Wales, women who were always part of the society became more prominent, and a conference was formed in 1976, a women's conference, and that only went into recess last year, 1994. The present conference of St Eugene's at South Wagga was integrated with women and around about 1975, and has happily continued on as a mixed conference since that time. And we've had young people, older people, married couples, and as a mixed conference I think it's been a great success. In 1975 we also started a centre over at Turvey Tops, which is still going and is still very successful, and is a great asset to our parish.
When our parish was new, we were very, very short of funds, and so everybody was told to make money. And Bill Brennan got the idea one winter's night, standing in front of the fire, that we'd have a concert. Got to have something novel that will get everybody in, and what about a concert? And seeing as we would be in it, probably, how about an over 40, everybody in it to be over 40. And so we knew a lot of people of our vintage. We were both over 40 at the time, and we knew we could, get a good concert together. So we set about that, and we got permission from Father to do this, Father Gallagher. And Father McGrath, of course, wanted to be in it, but he was 10 years too young. We wouldn't let him be in it. And everybody in that concert had to be over 40. The stage managers, the organisers, the usherettes, the ticket sellers, they all had to be over 40. The orchestra. And it was no trouble for us to get them. They were all thrilled. And we had a lot of fun, a lot of fun putting it together. And we even had over 50s and over 60s and over 70s in it, playing musical instruments and whatnot. But it was great. And Father Gilby, of course, was alive then, and he was a star turn. And he sang a solo in the first concert in 1957. In 1958 he was on the program to sing again, but he was very sick. And we got a message to say that Father Gilby was dying. He'd had a bad attack and he was up at Calvary. So, of course, we were very apprehensive during that second concert, wondering whether we'd hear the news of Father Gilby's demise. But anyway, Father Gilby got better, and he didn't come and join the concert program in ensuing years, but he supported us and came to see us. And the orchestra was great. We had 2 or 3 pianists and violinists, and there was in one of the concerts there was an instrumental quartet. We had we were dressed up. We had Red Indians, you name it, and we had it. I remember the Sundowners, and Mari Mullins will remember this because her father was one of the Sundowners, and they were sitting around a campfire, which was of course simulated by some red cellophane over an electric light globe and all leaves around it, and they were sitting there sitting on rolled up swaggies and billies, and they were having some music. They were a bit dead the first night, very dead, because most of these acts, when you'd give them to a group to do, you'd expect them to do them, and a lot of it was ad-lib. Well, these old boys weren't too good at ad-libbing, and they couldn't get going on this night. One fellow said, let's have some music, and they'd have a bit of music, and then they couldn't think of anything to say. So the next night I said, these fellows are dead, and I took a bottle of wine, and I poured it into the billy when they came out to fill the billy up, and they all tasted it the next, this was great, and when they tasted the wine, it sort of got the conversation going. Well, this brew's beaut tonight, let's have some more. We'll have some more of last night's brew, And Ina McMahon, and now I have known Ina since I was a child at Temora. We both lived at Temora when we were growing up, and I knew she was a dancer. And I said to her, "What do you do as a dancer?" Heavens, at my age, she was about, over 40 at the time. You can do it. So anyhow, she gets herself dressed up and she does a dance and goes out. Then when they encored her, she came in with a big placard, and on it was written "out of breath." She was too old to do an encore. She couldn't. We had a barbershop quartet with Fred Van Delft, Jack Munro, Bill Brennan and Ted Watson. And we had a barber's pole up there, and we had everything was, the stage was dressed accordingly for every act. We had a great backstage crew, and they were all over 42. And this Jack Munro, of course, had a few main parts in the concert. And he had his hair all brill cream back, so he was doing he was the one that was getting a shave in the barber's chair, and Fred Van Delft comes at him with one of these great big long knives and proceeds to put a big red cloth around him, and Jack, got a sort of a fright, and he said, "What's the red cloth for?" Because that was mostly ad-lib too. And Fred Van Delft said, "That's to catch the drips, you see."
Soon after the St Maria Goretti kindergarten opened, some of the men of the parish gathered to help the sisters with some of their tasks around the schools so that they could just concentrate on teaching more or less. Two of the men, Bill Hornby and Len Pettit, were very keen on Australian rules football, so they took a football along and they got the little boys there to run around chasing after the football, kicking the football and whatnot, much to the delight of Sister Raymond, of course. Your Sister Raymond was an avid supporter of Australian rules football, having been raised in the Lockhart-Ganmain area. A few years later, Turvey Park Football Club started a little midget competition, played on a Saturday morning at Gissing Oval. And the men decided that they would enter a team in this competition. It was for boys around about the age of 10 and 11 years of age, went up to 12 years of age anyway. Very successful competition because the Wagga clubs decided that they would enter teams too. But anyhow, St Maria Goretti had a side in this competition. The boys, being young and inexperienced at this game, didn't do very well at first. They copped a fair bit of stick early in the piece and were beaten by very large margins. However, their day was to come. And later on in 1961, I took over from Mick Powell, and we concentrated on teaching them the basics of the football game In 1962, they came from last on the competition ladder to play in the grand final, a game they didn't win, but they had the taste of winning.
In the very early part of the formation of the parish, Father McGrath and Father Gallagher called meetings of young people to discuss the formation of a youth group within the parish. And that was done very early, and had 3 or 4 meetings which young people were invited. And at the end of that, a youth group executive was formed, and they were then given the task of getting a youth group, shall we say, on the religious road. And Father Gallagher, as you know, was the parish priest, and Father McGrath was given the probably difficult task of being the chaplain to that group. I think the South Wagga parish was very, very fortunate in having Father Gallagher, or Father Gall as we all knew him, appointed. I think he found from previous experience that youth groups could be a problem. He certainly wasn't going to have any sort of problem from this inexperienced group of youth. We had more rules and regulations than you could follow, and I must say that he kept a very, very tight control on us, and in fact we were all pretty well petrified of him, which later proved unjustified, but at that stage things were fairly tightly controlled. And the parish didn't have anything, and neither did the youth group. We had nowhere to meet, no hall. The Marian hall was built quite a long time, I think in the 2nd year of the formation of the parish, and everything happened in the kindergarten. All parish meetings were there, youth group meetings were there. If anything happened, it happened in the kindergarten room, and naturally all the youth group activities was there. And we had sets of rules. We weren't allowed to scratch the floor or put hands on walls, break any glass, nail anything to the floor, dance in the area, or do absolutely anything. And he kept this very, very tight control. We were absolutely petrified. And as other people have said, the centrepiece of this youth group turned out in the long term to be plays. And our very first play was about Sir Thomas More and Henry VIII. And we were preparing for this play on one Sunday, having a practice. And quite innocently, one of the young people pushed the door, which was locked, and broke the door frame. Well, I really thought this would be the end of me, and I probably wouldn't see dawn of the next day. I thought Father Mac would probably be sent to the missions, to some station where they still had cannibals, and it really would be the end of it. So we decided we really couldn't be any worse off than we were. So we decided to fix it up, and we had quite a few good tradesmen. So we took the old timber away, got some new timber and put it on, and then we got some paint, and we exactly matched this paint. And we left on that Sunday thinking, well, we might get away with this. But I had a look at the job the next day, and it was terrible. It was like having a white door frame with canary yellow patches. It looked absolutely terrible. Now to this day, or to that day, Father Gallagher never said a word about it. But we didn't seem to be as tightly controlled. Perhaps he didn't think that we were going to drag down a perfectly good parish.
Father Gal was a great priest. He had some funny ways about him. He never took a holiday, and humanly speaking that's not a good thing. I think he used to take 2 days a year off, and he'd go to Queanbeyan, I think, which was his origin, in the Archdiocese of Canberra, and he'd be back home 3 days later. I remember on one occasion many years afterwards, now Archbishop, but then Bishop Francis Patrick Carroll, had to insist on his taking a holiday, to take time out in order to relax. And remember, in our 4 years together there was only one row we had, and unfortunately it was on Holy Thursday night. Somebody in the congregation at daily weekday masses complained that I didn't like the loud recitation of the rosary during the celebration of the Mass, and I used to stop them when we got to the beginning of the canon of the Mass. And Brian didn't like what I had done, and so we had one terrible row, I defending myself on a basis of liturgy, and he defending himself on the basis of the prayer of the people. About 4 or 5 months later, when I was shifted to North Albury, and the new parish priest that I had, Father Bongiorno, had said to me, "I believe you don't like the rosary being recited out loud during Mass." Well, he said, "I will celebrate the first Saturday Masses and you won't be disturbed by it." And less than a month later, Rome issued an edict that it wasn't to go on because it was against the spirit of the liturgy. I think I gave myself a pat on the back when it happened.
If anybody had been to Mass and heard Father Gallagher speak, they would know of the evils of excessive drink. And I think I should point out, though, that he wasn't against drinking. It was excesses really that he really honed in on. And he was a very generous man, and I think he really, underneath it, liked his youth group. And at one stage we were asked, the youth group was asked by Father Gallagher, to put on a play at Leeton. They had a festival at Leeton, and the whole diocese attended, and the South Wagga youth group had to put on the play. Father Gallagher took a group of us over there to erect the stage and get the backdrops and everything set up. And he's very generous. He looked after our accommodation for the night, made sure we had everything, and drove us over on the Saturday morning. And we spent a very hard day getting ready for this play. Father Gallagher had to leave late on the Saturday afternoon to come back for confessions, I believe. And he gave me, in those days, I thought, a fairly generous amount of money, and said, he said, "I think those boys of ours," he said, "might be pretty thirsty after a pretty hard day." And he said, "I think I'd like to be able to contribute to overcoming that thirst." And I thought, now there's a guy who knows what God wants, but also knows how people tick. And I think really he just was a tremendous guy. He also was a very hard worker. And he used to work at the speed of sound all the time. If he was going anywhere, walking anywhere as fast as he could go, driving anywhere as fast as he could go, he was run all the time. And they built up over the years a Fatima plays at Marian. And one particular week he said to me that we're going to have the plays on a particular day, and on the Saturday we should prepare and get the stage set up. At that time I was a building tradesman. And he said to me, "Look, I'll get all the men there, I'll get plenty of labour there, plenty of people to help. Will you please turn up with your tools and look after the job?" And I did. I arrived there about 8 o'clock of the morning, and I was the only person there, which I thought was a bit of a worry. And then along comes Father Gallagher to say that absolutely nobody could come. Everybody else had a reasonable excuse and nobody could come. So I said, "We are in trouble." He said, "I'll give you a hand." So he took his coat off, and the only time I've ever seen him with his coat off was in the presbytery. And he took his stock off too, which I'd never seen off before. And we then lined up, the two of us, to set up for this stage. Well, I'd never worked so hard in my life. And he never gave me a moment's peace. If I had to cut a piece of timber, he'd have a saw ready. By the time I had it sawn, he'd have it standing up with a hammer and 2 nails ready to go. I'd have the thing nailed up, he'd have the next bit ready. And very fortunately, by 11 o'clock, he said to me, "Look, I'll have to leave you for a while because I've got confessions." And I said, "Oh," and he said, "I'm very sorry." And I said, "Well, really, I wasn't very sorry at all. In fact, I could hardly stand." And so off he went. And I lay down on my back on the stage, and he said he's going to wait for 3/4 of an hour, for half an hour. I had a half an hour rest, and then I got up and staggered around, and he turned up his head again. So I haven't got much done while he went away. So in the next hour and a half, 2 hours, we finished the job, and I was able to go home, have lunch and have a rest. Now he was a man who was about 50 in those days, and I was about 20, and that's how he approached life.
I joined the parish in '54, and it was about 6 months later that girl turned up to my front door, and it was a very wet and windy and very cold Saturday afternoon. And Gell wasn't long in telling me that he wanted me to go up to the Marian tennis courts, or the site for the Marian tennis courts, and do some work up there. And I pointed out to Gal that it was a very wet day, very windy, and I don't think I would work very well in under those conditions. But to my surprise, I found myself up there. Merv Selwood and Roy Halloran had set out the footings for the shed, for the Maria Gretti tennis shed, the Marian tennis sheds. And I was supposed to do the boxing for the concrete, and the concrete was going to arrive on the Monday morning first thing. So the next day being Sunday, Gal wanted this job done on the Saturday afternoon. And here I was in the rain and in the wet, working away with Gal standing alongside me and not letting up until I'd finished the job. Because when I was finished, I was soaked through and very, very cold, and I said to Gal, well, look, I might get a cold out of this, a very heavy cold out of this, and I may not be able to go to Mass in the morning. And without a smile, Gal said to me, God will forgive you.
One of the most memorable attitudes that Brian Gal had was every time a priest came to the presbytery in South Wagga, which was a little cardboard house really, very feeble fibro building next door to the butcher's shop down in Burke Street. And every time a priest came to visit, Brian dropped everything else and gave his whole attention to the visiting priest. He was host to perfection to every priest who ever came to the place. And his normal day's work would be run. But when a priest came, either from the Diocese of Wagga or from anywhere else, Brian stopped and gave himself to being host to a visiting priest. And I have tried to follow that example in all of the years since, and I hope that has been one of the lessons that Brian Gal taught me. Because often when priests come to visit a brother priest, they come because they want to express their mind, their heart, their need, and very often they come and they want to confess their sins and their weaknesses, and they choose a particular priest to whom they can find peaceful reconciliation. And I'm sure that they often came to Brian Gal for that reason. Our Lady of Fatima feast day, or Our Lady of Fatima Sunday in October, was always a very big night where we put on the play and rendering the very many parts of the history of Mary, and Mary through history. And the male choir always came, the Catholic choir always came and led the singing, and we sang things in polyphony and in Latin, and all the people had their turn in singing the popular hymns to Our Lady. And we turned the backyard of Maria Gretti School into a great theatre, and a really, really happy night in October each year. If I could mention such people as Bill and Nell Brennan, the Hales. You never forget the dreadful death of Hale's daddy, would you? When in substituting for somebody else up a telegraph pole when he shouldn't have been there, and he crashed to his death. Can I mention Bill and Aileen Piltz, who lived behind the presbytery? When so many times I went through the back gate and into Aileen, and they had as one of the very special friends and guests a man who made in so many ways such a difference to our lives. His bishop in Fiji sent him out to Wagga to do a university course at the Teachers College to become a Catholic teacher back in his diocese of Fiji. And when he came, Father Gal had organised so many young prospective teachers into homes of the parishioners in South Wagga because the college couldn't hold them all. And the day before, Leone Rasalala, a tall, black, handsome Fijian, landed in the parish, and so Father Gall decided, well, we'll take him. So Leone boarded for 2 years in the presbytery in Burke Street in South Wagga. And he'd come home from college every day, and the first thing he'd do, he would strip off his shoes and socks and his pants, and he'd put his lap on, and he'd go round in his bare feet. And there he would do his homework and his studies. And he became very, very friendly with Bill and Aileen Pilts and their 2 children. Of course, I can't leave the presbytery situation without mentioning the housekeepers, can I? Dear old Queenie Davidson, God rest her soul. I've never tasted fish ever since, anything like the fish that Queenie used to cook. Queenie would split the fish down the middle and stuff it with sort of chook stuffing. And I've never tasted fish as lovely ever since. I suppose other mothers do it in one way or another, but Queenie's was a lovely fish. I remember on one occasion disappointing Brian Gall very much. We used to take it in turns going to celebrate the 6 o'clock Mass, 6 a.m. Mass every day in Calvary Hospital. And whichever of us went to celebrate the 6 o'clock Mass, the next job immediately after Mass was go to pick up Queenie down in the Sturt Highway and take her up to the presbytery to cook our breakfast. And the other one of us would be celebrating the 7 o'clock Mass at Our Lady of Fatima. And one very wet day, Brian is coming back from Our Lady of Fatima Mass, walking with an umbrella over the top of him, and he saw dear old Queenie sopping wet walking the other way, coming up to the presbytery. And when I got home, I got roasted. See, to be roasted by the parish priest is not the same thing as having a row with him. When you got roasted, you took your roasting. And Brian said to me, there are some things you don't forget, and don't forget again. He never ever discovered that I forgot the next day. And dear old Queenie walked up, but thank God it was fine. And she got there before he did. Dear old Mary Fenn was sort of in between some of the periods when Queenie had to go away, and then she became the head housekeeper. And Mary looked after us very diligently and very carefully. She became very friendly with Leone, and even though Mary wasn't the easiest one to for Leone to have chats to, he did often chat to her, and Mary would stay back at times to chat on and on with Leone, and I think sometimes keep him from his homework. But Leone was very tolerant and good, and Mary would go away with delights, and she often remembered the things that Leone had to say about his native territory in Fiji, and she was utterly delighted when eventually, going back there, he decided and said to the Archbishop, I want to become a priest. So Leone went to Rome to do his studies, and when the Aussie seminarians who at that time were studying in Rome were being impatient and put in a plea to the authorities in Rome to get a move on with the changes that the Vatican Council had decreed. And the first signature amongst the Aussies who were in all that was Leone Rasalala. And when I and the Pilses and another priest friend went over to Fiji in 1969 in celebrating his ordination, I remember the bus was late getting to the homemade cathedral up in his original home parish, and thinking that I was going to miss out altogether, so I ran up the hill after getting off the bus, and the Archbishop, who saw me coming, said, "Calm down, John, we haven't started yet, just get vested and follow us." And the procession went off, and I slapped the vestments onto me and landed at the sanctuary. And I said to the Archbishop, "What am I going to do? I don't know any Fiji." And he says, "You say it in English and we'll say it in Fiji and we'll all be happy." And it was the most marvellous occasion for the ordination of that marvellous man, Leone Russellala.
Of course, we had lots of fun making money to get the parish going, and one of the functions I can remember very vividly was the Decent Irish Boy, which was organised by Father John McGrath.
It was a play that I made up of a whole series of Irish songs, and we did it not only in South Wagga for St Patrick's Day, we took it out to Ganmain. And when dear old Monsignor Clark, a man in his early 80s, or even later than that, he was 56 years parish priest of Ganmain, dear old Monsignor Clark, I said to Brian Gall, "Father, what about the money that they pay?" "Oh," he said, "I think we'll leave that to Clarkie, and provided that he advertises our gymkhana on such and such a date. And if the people from Ganmain come in, well, we'll be happy enough with that." So I went out to Ganmain one evening, and I said to Clarkie, I said, "Father, what have you got on May the 14th? And he went and got his breviary, and he started to open it, and I thought to myself, what's the matter with him? I know what feast it is, what Sunday it is. And he opened it, and sure enough, inside the pages were the football fixtures. And he said, "Sorry, John," he says, "we can't be anywhere near South Wagga that day." He says, "We'll be out at Ardlethan playing footy." So he closed his breviary. Eventually, when we got out there and we had the concert, the top male singer had such a dreadful attack of laryngitis that he couldn't sing. And the only way we could put the play on was if I did the role myself. So they made me up and disguised me and dressed me up, and part of the show was that I had to dance with the leading lady, which I did. And when it came to everybody saying Thanksgiving afterwards, I made the comment about the money and the breviary and his football fixtures being one of the markers in his breviary, and of course he got it back on me by saying he thought we didn't recognise his voice and we didn't know him under his disguise, but we won't tell, will we?
I think that the seminary taught Father McGrath a great deal, but I think perhaps they hadn't spent a great deal of time preparing him for youth groups. And often now, as we know, chaplains, and he was a chaplain, often chaplains were only sort of like religious consultants who used to be there to make sure that nobody got off the religious rails. But Father Mac really saw himself as everything, and I mean everything. He was absolutely an integral part at every time, and he approached youth groups like he approached life. He was really an untamed, a multi-directional enthusiasm. And we used to have changes. We used to change from one thing to the other, and we used to have challenges. Every day with Father Mac was a challenge. He put everything in that he could put into it, and he used to set tasks which we knew we couldn't match, but at the end of the day he used to get us there. We are very uncultured, fairly average sort of people, but he thought perhaps he could make actors out of us. And in the end he did. In spite of ourselves, he did. And Father Mac really had a great relationship with everybody. Whilst some people didn't take him all that seriously, everybody respected him. And if Father Mac said to do something, do it they would. And I can well remember that we had a visiting club, and what we had to do was bring along the supper and arrange everything. And when we got there, we found we had more people than we ever thought we could have. And when we had a look at the supper, which our local club members brought along, we found we were short. Now, Father Mac wasn't going to be deterred about this, so he called up one of the girls, and I think it was Joan Kennedy, who was a very good cook. And this would be about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and we're going to have supper within the hour. And he said to Joan, "Look, Joan, we haven't got enough cakes. Go home, will you? Make a cake and bring it back in time for supper." Now, I'm quite sure at seminaries they could do that, but Joan, really as good a cook as she could, had some difficulty. But within the hour and a half, along comes Joan, a freshly baked cake, still warm, with the icing running down the side. And somebody said, "Joan, gee, she did a good job." She said, "Well, Father Mac said to make a cake, so I've just done what I've been asked."
I had strong rules about not drinking on the nights of the youth club and not smoking in the hall, but they were all defiantly disobeyed. And as chaplain, I knew that I couldn't do a whole lot about it, but I always grizzled and growled, and I always went crook at them. And but they thanked me for being tolerant, I think.
Father McGrath also was very keen on having things done the way he would like it. And he really liked to have a win every now and again. And I can remember well that we were always having firsts, because none of us had been a youth group before. None of us had been through the thing before. None of us had run a youth group before. Father Mac was in the same boat. So every time we did something, it was a first. And it was decided we should invite the parents along. And that Father Mac thought it would be a very good idea that each parent came in, they were given a little bag of lollies. Now, the youth group leaders really folded up at this and thought, well, they'd be a bit embarrassed if their parents turned up and each had a little bag of lollies. But Father McGrath rather stuck to his guns, and when we suggested perhaps we wouldn't do this, he really dropped the lip, actually. He really was very sad about this and thought it was such a good idea, and he couldn't see why the rest of us didn't like it. At any rate, we all decided there's nothing we could do but go along with this. And so we all voted to do it. In fact, if we took a revote, it would have been 10 against and 1 for. But we decided to go ahead just to keep him happy, to give him his win. The next night when we were home, and my sister Margaret was an executive at the same time, we were at home. The very next night, all the executive members turned up at our place, one after the other, for various reasons, and they all decided we really need to rethink this bag of lollies for the parents. And about 9:30, there's a knock on the door, and in comes Father McGrath, and wanted to know why we were all there. Everybody did the best they could to give him an excuse, and then we sort of said, "What are you here for?" He said, "I was thinking about those lollies last night." He said, I might have been wrong about that, and I'd like to change my mind." So everybody won, particularly the parents, because that would have saved a lot of embarrassment not to have to turn up and have a little bag of lollies from your children. Perhaps some of you might remember Father McGrath when he first came, and some of you might have even gone for a drive with him in the car, and that really was an experience, because I think probably Father hadn't had all that great experience of driving before he came to the parish. And he used to often take us to other clubs and that, and we used to go for a drive in the car, and he used to think it'd be a good idea to say the rosary. Now, for religious reasons it was very good, but for most of us we thought it really was like an insurance policy. It really was very necessary to say the rosary. And some of you might remember that the Presbyterian church was in Burke Street, and Father McGrath used to race up and down Burke Street. If he was going to the main street, if he was going to the hospital, if he was going anywhere, he'd be up and down that Burke Street, day and night, late at night, early in the morning. He was always up and down there. And also you might remember in the old days there was a railway line ran across the end of Burke Street, and it had gates on both sides. And when a train was coming along, a man used to rush out of the house and lock these gates so that none of the cars could come in contact with the trains. There was a rumour at one stage that these gates jumped out and hit Father McGrath's car. And even if it's only a rumour, it just shows that these trains really needed some protection from this religious driver. One thing about our club was that we were a bit different to the other clubs. We were the only really new youth group that was formed for a long time. And probably a lot of the established clubs really looked down on us. And the diocese had a diocesan committee, and they thought it'd be a good idea if we had visiting groups of executives to go around from one club to the other to try and show them how to run the thing properly and how to do the right thing. And it was decided this was going to happen. And the Wagga executive were told, or asked rather, to come and visit us to give us a few clues. Now, I think it would be fair to say that probably the relationship between South Wagga Youth Group and the Wagga Youth Group wasn't as cordial as some of the other clubs. And we were a bit concerned, really, that these people who'd been at it for years would come along and we wouldn't put on a very good show for them. So we decided we'd have a practice. So we did. We had a full executive meeting. We even had gospel discussion, which was pretty new to us. Fortunately, I think Peter Roxer had a bit of experience. Of course, Father McGrath did too. So we had our gospel discussion, and we even memorised our questions and our answers. We had made decisions prior to what we're going to say, about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So really, it was really like one of our plays. So along came Wagga executives, and we got started on the tee. We worked through item by item, decision by decision, gospel discussion by gospel discussion, and at the end of the day, it was quite good. I think the Wagga executive liked us even less than when they came, but we really thought that we won that day.
And part of the marvel of the people of South Wagga was that all of the older people, they came with such delight to support the youth club and their efforts, and I think that they were equally as proud of them as I was, and as they were of themselves, and as Brian Gall was, that they were part and part of the parish family life that we talk about these days, and it was very much alive in those days in South Wagga. And I don't think I've really had a youth club to be chaplain to anything like as good as.
Like all groups of young people, they were very interested in sport, and we had a lot of organised sport. We used to play in the local football competition, rugby league, with some success. We had tennis competitions, which we had night tennis. We used to play with other clubs. We had netball. Our girls were very good netballers. And we used to play cricket and quite a few other sports. So we really, a lot of our energy of the weekends and nights was spent in sport, in competitive sport. And it really was good. Visiting clubs would come, we'd play them sport, we'd go and see other clubs and we'd play with them again too. And we visited a lot of clubs. We visited Narandra and Leeton and Lockhart. I forget what the others were, but the particular one we did visit was Mascot. Now, when Father McGrath was going through seminary, he had a friend whose name I think was Father Grew. And Father Grew brought his Mascot youth group down here to Wagga, and they had a very good time. We had quite a good drinking team in the youth group, and they were fully occupied keeping these Mascot people entertained. But they were great people, and we had a lovely time. And sometime later decided that we should go down and visit Mascot. Now, it was a big job to get a large group of young people down to Sydney, and Father Mac never did the usual thing, so he decided what we should do is hire a plane. And we've got to remember, this is in the 50s, and the top-notch planes in those days was about a DC-3, which was really old at the end of the Second World War. At any rate, he saw David Kleinek, who was the manager of Ansett, and they hired us a plane. So there we were, all these young people, together with a couple of parents. Bob Hale's father went with us, another couple of people went as chaperones, and we flew down. They flew a plane up here, we flew down, we had a great weekend there. They took us out onto the harbour, we went and we had a picnic, we had a dance, we went out to I think it was Maroubra Beach. Nearly everybody got burnt. A couple of our people, when we got them home, even had to go to hospital, they got so badly burnt.
And we did extraordinary things with that youth club in South Wagga. We used to put on plays that would fill the hall for 3 whole nights. And people would come from all over Wagga and pay their money to see the youth club of Our Lady of Fatima, South Wagga, play, and they would laugh until they were sick. And I really believe that many audiences in theatres in Australia and elsewhere would have laughed equally with delight and joy with raw young men and women trained by a New Zealand man and his Irish wife, Nick and Nod Perry, playing the really top farce plays played in London and Sydney and Melbourne, and having us all in stitches. And I can remember giving Father Peter O'Leary and Dr. Joseph free tickets so that they could start the laughter and lead it. And in the middle of the front row was Bishop Henschke, and deaf as he was, he enjoyed it as much as any of the rest of us.
They had 15 or 16 actors in one of them, I can remember, and beside that there's another 15 or 20 people and young people involved in the makeup, building the set, selling the tickets, usherettes and all those sorts of things. And really amongst the actors we had no real core of trained people. I think there's Peter Sullivan and Margaret McRae were the only 2 actors we had. But everybody really did the best they could. And there were a few temperamental people too. And I can remember that we had a dress rehearsal, and that dress rehearsal was on a Saturday afternoon. The nuns and boarders from Mount Aaron boarding school were invited. I think the Loretta Home and Compassion people were invited. And just before the appointed time, one of the major actors couldn't be found. So Father McGrath dispatched somebody off to find him, only to find that he'd decided he wasn't going to be in any rate, wasn't going to come to the dress rehearsal, and wasn't going to be in the play. So Father McGrath handed me a script and said that I should take that part and I should read it, which I did for the first dress rehearsal, and then for the remaining performances I had to perform, which really showed when Father McGrath was around, you really were never safe. And we had a few people with particular experiences. I can remember a young guy by the name of Peter Piltz, who used to be our technician-in-chief. And when we had plays, he used to be up in the ceiling above the audience, and he had all his equipment set up there. He used to have the lighting organised, the sound, the music, the sound effects, and just everything. At the appointed time, Peter would make sure it was there. And it's a pretty dangerous area, and one night I can remember when we had a full audience, he missed his footing, slipped, and down through the ceiling, to the amusement of all the audience, came this rather large foot. We therefore had another ceiling yet to be repaired.
And I can remember one of those plays where the curtain opened and a female voice immediately behind me said, "Oh my God, if I hadn't just left my house, I'd swear they were my curtains." And I turned round and I said to Alma Nugent, "Al, I left the house after you did."
I think too, to attribute to Father Gallagher and his long-sightedness, is that he saw a need to have somewhere for young people to go after they finish with their youth group. And the youth group I've spoken to are young people who go from the age of probably 15 to say 23, 25. And he decided to set up a senior youth group. And it was interesting that Peter Rocks, who was involved in the youth groups I've spoken about, was the organiser of the senior youth group. And I gained a lot from my short experience with the senior youth group, as I met Nola O'Malley, who became my wife. And I really owe a lot to the South Wagga Parish for that, and for all the other things the South Wagga Parish has done for me.
I was at South Wagga Parish in 1959 to 62 for 3 years, and then I went off to North Albury, and we lived down in a little house down on the corner. It was a time of fair amount of activity. I followed Jack McGrath, and there were lots of things for kind of moving from as a, I suppose, a time that when the parish was just starting to come alive, and there was a lot of activity in the parish. I suppose the main basis of ministry was to get to know people, and so there was a lot of time spent in going around visiting people. I had the area up and the housing commission up on the other side of Fernley Road, and used to go around and visit everybody in that area, and that got me to know a lot of people in the parish. And then I was involved with the youth, and involved in all the activities that were more or less going on in the parish. We used to split duties and spend or alternate from mass times in spending times at Calvary and Uranquinty and in South Wagga. So that was that system, I think, still works in the parish. I suppose the interesting part of all this was the times in which we lived, which was the beginning of state aid, and Ray Storia and Brian Allen and Alan Taylor, I suppose, were people who came to mind that were working very close with Father Gall in moving in that way and trying to put pressure on the government for state aid, and they were very active in the parish in those days.
My association with the South Wagga Parish began in 1953. For a couple of hours each day, I assisted Sister Veronica in the infant school. I did copywriting in the students' books. I corrected their sums. I helped with social science, with craft, sport and music. It was a great experience for me, and I loved it. In '58, I received my first teaching appointment to years 3 and 4 at St Maria Goretti's. From 65 to 68, I returned again to St Maria Goretti's, this time as year 5 and 6 teacher and as principal.
Father Gall had lots of groups going that used to move and look at social issues, and I suppose a lot of the people who were in these groups moved out ultimately to St Isidore and took up the challenge out there. The youth group was, Father Jack McGrath left it in a very strong position, and it was very much caught up in activities and concerts and plays. I suppose I just stood back and let it all kind of reasonably happen within some degree of order. There wasn't too much order, but there was a little bit.
During my time, I saw many changes, too numerous to mention. I remember when the parish house was a private home. It had a high fence, and behind that were luscious fruit trees. And the Walmsley boys were the expert at picking the fruit at the right time, and at times also retrieving tennis or cricket balls.
Charlie's bat came into prominence in those days, where we used to have the beginnings of social games of cricket with the seniors in the parish, and there were many a duel that was fought over the 3 years regarding Charlie's bat.
Named after Charlie Cattell, who donated this singular bat, made of prime kerosene timber. The said trophy was very keenly played for and was held with great pride by the winning side.
From there started the Marian Cricket Club.
Our first meeting to form the Marian Cricket Club was held at St Maria Goretti Primary School kindergarten rooms under the supervision of Father Gall. After a lot of talk and promises of support, it was decided to go ahead, and we named the club the Marian Cricket Club. And our first president was elected was myself, Albie Hetherington. The senior secretary was Brian Allen Jr. The treasurer was Peter Horn. John McInerney was elected captain of the team. Jim Bullis was elected as wicket-keeper or long stop, and Father Gall was named as our patron. Subs was fixed at 10 shillings or $1, and ball fees at 4 and 6. And don't they wish these fees were still in existence now, because it has become very, very dear to run a club. If my memory serves me correctly, the following people made up the committee: Brian Allen Sr., Brian Allen Jr., Mike Allen, Jim Bullis, Barry Lonsdale, Peter Pills, Jim Sullivan, Alec Hackett, and others to join in later years was Alan Hull, Father Mossville and Ned Murphy. We were nominated in grade 3 of the local competition with the following teams our opposition: St John's, Turvey Park, the Teachers College, Tarcutta, East Wagga, Country and South Wagga, High School and Oberon Valley, which is up near Tarcutta.
The name of the cricket club was changed from Marian to St Michael's in the mid-1980s. This has allowed the St Michael's Cricket Club, in conjunction with St Michael's School, to adopt a youth policy, and this will serve many purposes. 1. The growth of the cricket club and cricket in Wagga Wagga. 2. The chance for players to learn the sport. 3. To develop and mature sports-minded people to play competitive sport within a code of ethics that will enhance their ability and outlook to join the community wherever they may live.
And our involvement with the football too, with the Marian Football Club, that all started in those days where some of the parents got very interested in trying to do something which was a bit more extensive for the young people in that area.
We'd sent a message around the schools to find out how many boys would like to play Australian rules football if we did form a club, and we got around about 70 odd names of boys who wanted to play football with a parish football team. And so the job was there. We called a meeting which was held at Gissing Oval in the dressing rooms there, and 27 people attended that meeting, and it was decided that we would form a club. And in February of the following year, 1963, we had a meeting and I came up with a constitution which was presented to Father Gallagher because he was to become the spiritual director of this parish club. Father Gall gave us permission to use the title Marian for the name of the club, and so we named it the Marian Junior Australian Rules Football Club. The Marian Dons were to become very well known right throughout the region, because in 1963 the Marian Dons won an undefeated premiership, and in 1964 they won another undefeated premiership, and in 1965 a one-game loss premiership. So you can understand that they went very well indeed. Now, when we formed the Marian Junior Football Club, we realised that as boys turned the age of 12, we just couldn't let them go. We had to have a competition for them to follow up. And so we got together the clubs around Wagga and mooted a competition, a Wagga-based competition for boys under the age of 16s, having 14s and 16s, and we were very successful doing that because the Wagga Junior Australian Rules Football League was formed, and we had Wagga East, Wagga North, Wagga, Turvey Park and a team from the RAF playing in this competition. Many good players came through our ranks, many good footballers, came through our ranks. Most of them played senior football around this area, and others went on to bigger and greater things. For instance, we had Greg Brentnell, who went through the Marian Hawks and coached by L.B. Hetherington. He went on to play with Turvey Park, Australian Rules Football Club. He also went down to South Melbourne, the then South Melbourne was now the Sydney Swans, and tried out down there. He tasted the life down there, didn't like it, and returned back to Wagga and played a little bit more with Turvey Park Australian Rules, and then turned his attention to rugby. He played with the Turvey Park Lions, and from thence he went to Canterbury. Played with Canterbury, represented his state, and also played test football for Australia. And we pride ourselves that Greg's grounding was with the Marian Junior Football Club. Another protege of ours was John Patura. John went to Melbourne, and unlike Greg, he stayed in Melbourne. He played with South Melbourne. He represented Victoria and also captained the side of Victoria and was named in the All-Australian side at that time.
A throwaway remark by Father Burgess, now Monsignor Michael Burgess, then assistant to Father Gallagher, to a group of young South Wagga Parish mothers, led to the formation of the Marian Tennis Club. These young women hired either Grandview or Hopwood Park courts each week in order to get together and play the sport they enjoyed. Or, to quote a nearby resident, play a bit of tennis, laugh a lot, and feed and chase the kids. Father Burgess's remark when he wandered in to visit on a tennis day was, "Why are you hiring courts when the parish could have its own?" None of us knew that there was an overgrown court at the side of the parish house facing Fernley Road, and so the seed that became the Marian Tennis Club was planted. A meeting was called on December the 10th, 1959, to discuss establishing a tennis court on the grounds. Chairman for the meeting was Kieran Kennedy. Mrs. Nancy Fitzpatrick moved that a tennis club be formed. This was seconded by J. Kennedy. Mrs. June Murphy moved that the club be named Marian Tennis Club, seconded by Nancy Fitzpatrick, and carried unanimously. Working bees were held to clear the site and prepare the area to build 2 courts. Father Gallagher organised a loan totalling £1,500, $3,000, for court construction. The year 1960 was spent establishing the courts and shelter shed. By June 1960, the fencing was completed and water pipes were laid. In early July 1960, the courts were ready for use. The official opening was held on April the 16th, 1961. The ceremony was performed by Bishop Henske and attended by Fathers Gallagher and Burgess, club members and visitors from other tennis clubs in Wagga and District. The first fundraising venture was the Patrick's Day concert in 1960. Father Gallagher suggested that if the club organised and staged the concert, they could have the proceeds. Members of the clubs, ladies and men, became performers for the night. Their chorus line, directed by Pauline Harvey, sang and danced their way through Harrigan and the Daughter of Rosie O'Grady. The Marian Hall was full and the concert items enjoyed by both audience and performers. The proceeds for the night amounted to over £75. Subsequently, most fundraising activity involved tennis tournaments, cake stalls, along with profits from court hirings. Determined to move ahead rapidly, the club discussed the lighting of the 2 courts in June 1961 and called tenders for the erection of the 2 additional courts. A quote from Olding's excavation for £200, $400, to build 2 courts was accepted in August 1961, and at the same time Mr. John Gestier's quote for £500, $1,000, to erect lights on the 2 courts to be built, in preference to the original courts, was accepted. The lighting was to be fluorescent and was the first of its type in Wagga. In August 1961, the club was affiliated with the Wagga Tennis Association and had entered 5 teams in the summer night competition. By March 1962, the 2 additional courts and the lighting had been completed and a toilet block erected. Membership had grown to 104. 53 senior members and 51 juniors. The club continued with fundraising, and when assistance was needed by the Wagga Tennis Association to build the complex at Bolton Park, the Marian Tennis Club gave a very generous donation of $500 to the project. Trouble began for the club when at a meeting in July 1975, the president, Merv Selwood, informed those present that he had been notified that the 2 lower courts to be taken from the club in order to extend St Maria Goretti School. The lights were dismantled from these 2 courts and erected on the present courts adjacent to Fernley Road. The clubhouse was also moved to its present location. The condition of the courts deteriorated during the illness and following the death of Merv Selwood. Now, thanks to the efforts of the enthusiastic and hard-working club members, the courts and clubhouse are once again in good condition. Father Gal, the leading light of early days, will always be remembered for his support and for making the rough way a little smoother for the novices in the art of building tennis courts. Also well remembered is the active support of the tennis-playing priests of early days. Archbishop Carroll, Monsignor Burgess, Fathers Cruz, Lever, Mossfeld, Conway and Flanagan.
I came to South Wagga in 1962 to take charge of the newly built Bishop Henschke Boys Primary School. At the opening, the school was opened by Bishop Henschke himself and by Wal Fife as the member for Wagga in those days. Father Gallagher, of course, was the well-known and well-loved parish priest. The inaugural staff of the college was Mrs. Herrick, Mrs. M. Butts, Mr. Jim Dwyer, Mr. Terry Fromholtz, Brother Mills, Brother Petrie, Brother Noonan and myself. In those days there was no government aid, and so we had 8 teachers and 8 classes, no library, no office, but Mrs. Kerwin used to come across as a volunteer secretary and as a volunteer pianist. She was of a tremendous help to us. Mrs. Zaboyski used to clean the school and do it very thoroughly. South Wagga Parish was only 7 years old then, and was a young and vibrant community. My most lasting impressions of the people was of their open, generous and supportive nature. The boys of the school were outstanding also, not only in school itself, but in the way they helped on weekends because we had so much to do.
One Sunday when Father Gull was going to give one of his tremendous sermons, and he took over this day, was going to preach at all masses, and I was saying the mass, and he was really on high C, screaming and roaring, and a little girl, a little blonde-haired girl, was in the second seat from the front, just where the organ is now, and in the middle of his screaming she yelled out, "Ah, shut up!" And the whole church burst asunder, and that was the end of that sermon. She really put an end to it. Father Gull was always screaming and roaring in his sermons, and then when you were talking to him afterwards about the sermons, he was always making apology for the people about whom he was speaking. So while he was screaming and roaring on the altar, he was very forgiving when he was outside of the church. I never really understood how he could preach for so long and scream and roar and say the Mass so quickly after that. It was amazing. He'd go down from the pulpit and very soon the Mass would be over, and I never really understood how that could be. While I was at South Wagga, Mrs. Hunt, feeling very sorry for the kids who couldn't read and write, began a personal helping service to those kids, which later flourished and blossomed into a thing of great help to a lot of people. It was at the first place in the boys' school and then later to the other school, and it's gone all around the diocese and is everywhere. But some of the people at the time couldn't read or write, and they said in later life it was only for the wonderful work and caring of Mrs. Hunt that they learned to read and write and were able to go out about their affairs as adult people in the world. I've always thought of that, and I thought what a wonderful action that wonderful lady did, and it should be written somewhere in posterity.
I was born in Tocumwal, and there I spent my early life and went away to boarding school in Ballarat, and after some years and working in my father's general store in Tocumwal, he'd died in the interim, I chose to enter in the priesthood. And I remember that I couldn't quite make up my mind whether to go away to a mission country or whether to go to the diocesan priesthood. And anyway, Wagga prevailed. The bishop came down to see me, Bishop Henschke in those days, and I decided to enter the diocesan priesthood. And then I was in my mid-20s then, and which of course was considered rather ancient by the standard of the times going into the seminary. This is before Vatican II. I went off to Springwood, and I remember my first day there, somewhat in trepidation. Here am I in my mid-20s. I'd left school some years before, and I was met at the gate by Father Charlie Holsworth and Bob Lever, and their first words to me were, satanned and all dressed, and they said, "Don't let the bastards break you. That's all the advice we give you." So, well, then it was 8 long years of trying to not let them break me, because truly that was their way of bringing you to the fullness of priesthood as they saw it, and that was that you had to conform and that you had to keep the rule, and that was a sign of real dedication. So our apostolate within the seminary was one of routine, and coming out of the old monastic school, greatly influenced by the Irish tradition that we were brought up in our priesthood. So over those years, Bishop Henschke used to often come and visit us and tell us about the diocese, and those years of coming down and visiting my family in the southern part of the diocese and calling at the cathedral on a hot day and being greeted at the door, which was a great tribute to the man himself. But there was Bishop Henschke with dark trousers and singlet on, and as you knocked on the front door and inviting you in to come in and have a drink. And he made you feel very comfortable. My first appointment after ordination, in 1963 I was ordained, was to Narandra, and I spent 2 years there. I think your first parish always has a big impression upon you, and I enjoyed that greatly. I loved the river and I loved the whole atmosphere of everything. And by this stage, Frank Carroll was our bishop, and I can remember how going on, oh no, he wasn't actually, but not so long after that, but I can remember being taken out and taught water skiing, or invited to, out at Galore, and there we were sitting on the banks of the Murrumbidgee. This was mid-Sunday afternoon, and not long afterwards a car came up the roadway, dust flying, and someone said, "Oh, it's Father Carroll." He was on his way and somebody invited him along to go water skiing. So there he sat on the bank, and then he took his turn on the river, and he fell off and enjoyed a drink and did everything that I think should be a great foundation for all bishops, to be as relaxed and at home with their people as Frank Carroll was in those days. So after my time in Narandra, I quite suddenly got moved across to South Wagga. These days people are consulted and there's great deliberation before you move, but in those days that just didn't happen. You were just told you were going somewhere and you accepted it unquestioningly. I guess those in the seminary thought that, well, they'd trained us well if that's the way it was, but well, I came away and I was a little sad to leave Narandra because I'd formed many friendships and I tried to be an ecumenical person. And that too, I was always grateful to my parents in a small country town, having taught me to move and to mix among people and to appreciate people of different religions. And Narandra was a good opportunity for that.
I remember one day going up to the school, and Sister Veronica, who was then 80 years old, and she had 90 children in kindergarten, and she had them in the church at 9 o'clock in the morning, And I went up to the church, as I usually did, to pray my divine office. And here she was coming out of the church behind the whole lot of them. And I said, couldn't you pick them up and hug them? And Veronica said, yes, I could do that all my life. But it was against the rules to have that kind of emotional delight in hugging the most gorgeous creatures that God ever made. And I've often remembered it afterwards, where the sisters who gave their lives to help us, the priests, and to do the marvellous education job they did in many other places besides South Wagga, but that was my first experience of being chaplain to a Catholic school. And dear old Veronica taught me the lesson of how great their sacrifice really was. That much as they would have loved to take the little children up in their arms, to comfort them and to express the emotional love, they couldn't do it. It was against their religious vows, as they thought. And I tell you what, when they all got to heaven, the expression of God's love for them would certainly make up in abundance for what they deprived themselves of in their lives as teaching nuns of the various orders of teachers. Not only Mother Mary MacKillop's sisters, but Nana Nagel's presentations, and the Mother Mary McAuliffe's Sisters of Mercy, our own Australian founded Sisters of the Good Samaritan. Every one of them lived for years and years and years in that mentality. And without them, we priests couldn't have achieved anything like what God asked us to do when we vowed ourselves in celibacy to be the priests of the church that are so necessary in the task of bringing the people home to God. And when I look back on the marvellous things that happened to me in the first 4 years of my priestly life, all I can say is thank you to you all. Thank you, Brian Gal. Thank you, Sister Josephine, Sister Paul, Sister Veronica. Thank you, Sister Ambrose.
Our relationship with the presentation sisters of Maria Goretti were cordial and very friendly. I remember particularly Sister Anne Ganane, full of life and vivacity. These were such wonderful days. I'll never forget Sister Anne on horseback in full regalia. She'll never forget the fact that I promised her a swimming pool.
What are the features, as I see them, of the South Wagga Parish? And what are my memories? Overall, it has been the sense of community, the reality of people being with each other, of people pulling together, working together, people with a common goal. There has always been a sense of people caring for each other, of reaching out to one another. There has always been compassion, genuine concern when tragedy strikes or when illness affects a family. In reflecting upon my years of involvement in South Wagga Parish, I see people as the most valuable gift and resource. Many, many individuals come to mind. I would like to name a few. Firstly, there was Father Gal, or Right You Are Good Good, as he was known. There was a person who loved his people, loved his God, and he made sure everyone heard the message. Lay teachers such as Mrs. Lawson and Mrs. Neen were extraordinary people, and these were followed by the memorable Mulrooneys. Other people stand out in my mind. Included in those are the Cousners and Davies families. Pat Cousner had every room heated when we arrived at school on the cold, frosty mornings. And no one loved the environment more than Eddie Davies. It was Eddie who sowed the grass in the St. Maria Goretti's playground, and who faithfully changed the hoses every couple of hours during the summer season. Who could beat that effort? In more recent times, we had Joan Southwell, the faithful caretaker of the tuck shop, and Mrs. Margaret Cullen, who has been a faithful and true friend to so many priests, people and students. Both these ladies gave themselves untiringly to St Maria Greddy's and later to Henschke Primary. Brother O'Carrigan is another character that comes to mind. He had a very positive influence in the parish. He loved the boys and the boys loved him. He was very talented and gifted in the drama area, a man with lots of ideas, but we're still waiting for him to complete the swimming pool.
So many to remember. The tuck shop ladies, the parent-teacher nights, the school concerts, the Estedfords, Mr. John Ryan taking us all to Falls, taking the senior kids anyway to Falls Creek for skiing. Dr. Joseph, the Fitzpatricks, June Hetherington, the Baxters, the Francis, Margaret and Bob Cullen, and a host of others that it would be impossible to mention here, but I would like to thank them all for all the help they gave us. One particular feature was the send-off to Mrs. Herrick after she left to go to Canberra. Present were Brother Mills and Jim Dwyer, Brother Carney, Mrs. M. Ryan and Mrs. Molly Robb, and Mr. K. Muir and Brother O'Brien. And then the swimming carnivals that were held at the Wagga Pool. They were great days, and the kids thoroughly enjoyed them. 6th class, 1964. What a fine-looking lot they are. The school out in the quadrangle at lunch. That quadrangle that we thought so much of. Scenes from the 3rd class, Blackbird, Pie. The King, J. O'Brien. And the world's best helpers, building the playground equipment. The equipment that caused strife with the Police Boys Club. They thought we were outdoing them. The helpers, Kevin Flanagan, Lindsay Guest, Max Sydenham, Michael Clear, and hosts of others. Then the trip with the boys to Canberra for the Estedford, when they visited Parliament House, the War Memorial, the Mint, and then performed creditably in the Estedford, winning it and bringing the trophy back to Wagga.
And when I came to South Wagga, I was there with Father Gallagher. And I suppose a lot's been said and will be said over these days about Father Gal, but he was a unique person. He was a different parish priest. He was a parish priest in the old tradition. When we look back at it in these days, everything was more or less under his control. And although we had parish councils and we had various things, he liked to keep a finger on every pie. And he would always be in his black suit, and he would be at every meeting that you had. He'd have to drop in for a while, by way of encouragement, but also by way of keeping an eye on everything, that it just didn't move in a direction he didn't really want it to. And you'd be allocated to go down and to visit the hospital. Calvary was under our jurisdiction, but you would go to the hospital and you look over your shoulder and there Gal would be on his way around behind you, just in case you'd missed someone. But also it would be a point of talking that night. And he never wanted to be beaten by the fact that you'd met somebody in the parish that he didn't know about, or that someone arrived in town that he didn't know of. Because sure as you'd say something about someone, he'd say, oh yes, that his father was a train driver in Junee or something or other like that. He'd find some connection to say that he really knew about them. But it was his way of letting you know that to be part of a parish you had to know your people, and he was a past master of that. he was a very disciplined person. He never wanted to seem as though he was at ease about life. Well, he was at ease really within himself, I guess, but I didn't find it all that difficult to live with him. Most people found him in his early days as being too regimented, but there was a real warmth about him, and he had a great capacity to talk to people and share with people's problems. It almost seemed incongruous. He almost became another persona, a different person when he climbed into the pulpit, because, and not that I ever sat in the congregation, but I remember in those days we used to have to help with communion over in the church you knew how to time it. I mean, there wasn't a matter of going over there and waiting around the door to see how far into Mass he was in order to give out communion. I can remember we used to sit out on the back balcony at the presbytery at the Fatima, and we'd read the Sunday papers while Father Gal was over saying Mass, that 9 o'clock Mass or whenever it was, and we could hear his voice echoing across from the church over the school into where we were sitting at high pitch. And as soon as he stopped, which meant he'd finished preaching, we'd immediately get dressed to go straight over, because from the time he'd climbed out of the pulpit to the time he gave communion was just time enough for you to get a soutane on and get across, because he'd go to the rest of Mass pretty quickly. But that's the style of the person. It's always puzzled me how he was such a contradiction, in that he was such a warm, caring, generous person, and yet somehow or other, when he climbed into that pulpit, he took on another way of life. But that's what he thought. He had to warn the people and challenge, and that was part of him. He was a very, very hospitable person, that, he always encouraged you to bring your family or bring your friends home, and he always made people feel welcome. And I'm grateful to this day in my priesthood that Gal taught us that. He liked not to be the last one to bed at night. He always felt that he had to be there because you might like to talk about something. So he'd sit in that chair and he'd be dozing off to sleep, and the paper would fall to the floor, and you'd say something or other, and he'd wake up with a jerk, and of course he'd have to have a comment about whatever was on television, even if he hadn't seen it. But he had to be there, and he had to be part of your life at night, as we gathered around that. So he would not go to bed until everybody else had gone to bed. This was part of, being there. And first thing, of course, in the morning, he had to be first up, so that he was on duty all the while, available, I would say, is the way he'd look at it. And I never really felt all that comfortable about all black. I guess it's part of my being out in the world before I entered the priesthood, when I'd see people in black around our football ground at Tokemall, and I'd always think, God, they're isolated away from people. And I thought, well, that's not entirely me, but that's a personal thing. But Gal would have that black suit on, and even at one stage the yardman wasn't around to do the toilets, and guess what? He still had the black suit on with the overalls over the top over there scrubbing the toilets out. And I thought, well, example's good, but can go to extremes at times. But he's a great person like that. And I was allocated the central part of the parish to visit, so I knocked on doors. In those days we did much more of that. But then again, you see, Gal did all the weddings, he did all the baptisms. This was always his role as the parish priest. He kept control of all that. Not all the baptisms, but he did practically everything. So our main work was knocking on doors, getting to meet people, and encouraging them to, in their lives, their personal lives, and coming along to the sacraments, whatever it was.
One day, just after I got to South Wagga, I was talking to Wal Grant, now deceased, and I told him that I was looking for a horse, and he said, Revo, I might have one that'll just suit you. It was part trotter, but not a bad horse. It's broken in and it hasn't been used, so you can take that and try it, and if it's any good to you, well, then you can buy it if it suits you. So he told me where it was, and I took the blacksmith out, Hodgie by name, and the horse was supposed to have been broken in, but anyway, it took us about 3 hours to get the horse shod, because we couldn't pick up its feet. So then we thought the horse was really knocked out after all this resting when we got the shoes on it. So I decided I'd ride it home, and it was out the other side of Gumley. So I got out on the road on the horse, and it hadn't been on the road, and it obviously didn't have much time under saddle in its preparation, because as soon as we got onto the road, all hell let loose, and I advanced about 200 yards in about 2 hours. I was due on Mass at 5:30 in the afternoon, and at 7 o'clock there were search parties out looking for me because I'd missed out on Mass. The fact of the matter was that I couldn't get the damn horse along the road. It was frightened of everything. That I didn't get to Mass on time because of that horse. I'd have to say that the horse was never any damn good. It always had a mind of its own. It used to buck on the slightest provocation, and I ended up putting it through the sale, even though I used to get Father Kevin Flanagan to hold it while I tried to get on. I'd get on, but I couldn't make the damn thing go.
I was pretty keen on sport, and I liked to, even though I was only there for 12 months, but I loved going down swimming, and I liked going to the football. I found out one day, I never felt completely relaxed with Gal to say that, I was going to do something that was going to absorb a day, because you always felt you had to be doing some work. I remember one time I went down, I thought I've timed this pretty well. Sat up and had lunch, and I thought if I whiz down to Mangapla, I'll see half the football and be back in time for confessions, as we called them then, before the evening mass. But I didn't say anything about this. So down I drove to Mangapla, and lo and behold, I was watching the game around the fence, and the poor old goal umpire had a heart attack, and down he went. Well, he's lying prostrate on the ground, and they're calling for an ambulance over 2WG, and it's a whole... And I thought, God, I'll have to go out to this poor bloke. I mean, he could be a Catholic, and here am I leaving him. So, I had the clerical collar on, so I climbed over the fence and went out to him. And somebody said, yes, he was a Catholic. They'd shared with him, been sharing with him over in Geraldry years ago, and knew of that of him. So I thought, well, I better stay with him. And so I knelt down beside him, and a nurse came over, and we attended to him until the ambulance came along. The game started up again, and away they went and kicked the ball up and down. The poor bloke's dying at our feet, but the game had to go on. The poor fellow did die later on. But of course, my cover was blown, because by the time I got back to Wagga and I sat down at the meal table that night, and I thought, God, do I tell Gal that I was down there or not? I thought, he will know, he knows everything, and so he'll find this out pretty soon. Because there am I sitting out in the middle of the field helping this poor bloke meet his Lord. So I did tell him, and he didn't question why I was at the football, only that, well, I'm glad that I gave you the fellow the last rites. That was the important thing. But in many other ways, he was a person who touched me greatly. I say that because he had a pretty fearsome reputation in those days when you went there as an assistant priest, but he was far beyond that.
When I was going for a ride one day on another horse that I had, somebody said to Father Gal, oh, I saw you on a horse. And he said, no, I'm sorry, that's not right, it was the wrong bald head. And at that stage of the game, I didn't think Father Gal knew that I was riding horses around Wagga or going to the pony club, but he obviously knew and hadn't let on. I'm not very sure that he actually liked it. But anyway, he couldn't do much about it, because it was a way of getting on with the kids and their parents, and in those days there were many young people from the parish associated with the pony club.
Many things I remember, the visits to the hospital, the friendships I formed, and also the catechism classes. Gal didn't like us going into the state schools, and I always used to feel so guilty at people like Mrs. Piltz and everybody else. You'd organise them and drive them down to the school and drop them off. In those days, Catholic education was a contentious issue, and Gal was of the thought that if the priests go into the school to teach religion, into the non-Catholic schools, then it weakens our position. But I felt very guilty about that, because we'd drop them off and then away we'd go. And I can remember going back to Bill Piltz's house, and after that, I've only been there a short while, and it was a hot day, and they just endured a catechism class, and I walked into the house, having driven them home, and I was asked, would I like a drink? Would I like a cup of tea? And when the fridge door was opened up, there were a couple of bottles of beer. I said, actually, I'd much prefer a beer than I would a cup of tea. And they thought, oh, thank God, you're quite a normal person after all this. So that began a long relationship then of eating New Zealand epicure cheese and having a glass of beer, and the Piltz family is strong in my heart because of that. And along with all the other people that I met, the people who gave us hospitality. I don't want to mention names, because if I mention someone, then perhaps I overlook another, but the Humbles and the Francis and the Josephs, all those people that were there in that time, I felt made us feel very welcome. And so my time there was a very fruitful one. I only spent 12 months there, and I can remember when I got this unexpected move again. I was then moved down to Albury, and I met one fellow who was a bit of a character, and he said, this is the way he viewed my being moved. He said, I always thought that Francis Carroll was a pretty smart bloke, he said, but it took him 12 months to wake up to you. He said, I was on to you a month after you were here. He said, how you lasted 12 months, I don't know. He, being a bit of the outgoing character, he viewed his priest in that light. So anyway, I then moved away from there, and I have a very cherished gift that was given to me when I left South Wagga in a farewell, and that's a nice silver water jug that I use regularly, and I'm very happy for that.
It was during my time there that Father Gull got shifted from South Wagga to become parish priest of Griffith, and the people decided that they would give him a fitting send-off, and so they did. They gave him a wallet of notes as well as a new car, so they could successfully negotiate the journey from Wagga to Griffith. And Father Gallagher, of course, was always known by those who lived with him as rather stern of countenance, and often enough not very happy within the presbytery, and could put people very much on edge, especially those who were trying to live a normal life. Be that as it may, chinks in the armour began to appear just before he left South Wagga, and when he was presented with the car and the wallet of notes, he couldn't believe that people could be so kind and so loving and so understanding, and he really broke down and sobbed at the very wonderful gift and the love that the people showed him. I'd have to say that while we found him difficult at times in the presbytery, people outside in time of stress and strain and sorrow found him the most wonderful help, the greatest carer, and always available no matter what it cost him. So the people had real reason to show that they loved him with a great intensity, even though they probably hated going to Mass when he used to scream and roar and say Mass so quickly. So while I might criticise him a little bit in one way, there was this tremendous regard and love for people that he always had, and when they showed their appreciation, he found it a little hard to accept that they loved him so much.
When Brian came to the end of his life, he was a man who gave his whole life to God and to church. He was a man who was two men, really. He was a man who was most loved by the people of South Wagga for his compassion, for his understanding, for his patience, for his spirit of forgiveness, and they very much loved him for giving full time to everything of their needs. But when he was in the pulpit, he was a madman. He used to go purple in the face, and I'd be in the sacristy waiting to help him with Holy Communions before I went out to Urine Quinty for the 8 o'clock Mass. And the whole of the Mass really, from the end of the homily to the last blessing, went in about, would you say, 10 minutes? And I'm sure God was on his side and he was on God's side, but it was, liturgically, it was a very big distraction. And I know that some of the people of God who loved him very dearly went to him a couple of occasions and said, Father, you don't have to shout at us in the preaching. We can hear you. But he shouted, and he kept on shouting. I've often wondered why he disturbed himself so much in his preaching, because he really did love the people and he really did love God, and he really did love the church, and he really did love the Mass. But he was a different Brian Gall when he was in the pulpit. When he came to die, he was the Vicar General of our diocese, parish priest of Griffith, and he was over with all the rest of the priests in the year of prayer for priests, 1979. And all of the priests gathered around myself and Bishop Francis Carroll, who were classmates in the seminary and who were celebrating our Silver Jubilee as priests. And at the end of the dinner, at which Brian spoke on behalf of the priests, and to our utter amazement he spoke for less than 5 minutes, which was totally un-Brian. And at the end of the dinner he went around and shook hands with all of the priests before they left to go back to the bishop's house, to the cathedral. And he came to me and with a big smile on his face he says, well done John, goodbye. And he shook my hand and he put his other hand on my upper arm. And that to me spelt, with Brian Gall, a sexual attack. Because there was never any sign of Brian showing emotional feeling for another human being, much less a male priest. And he left after everybody else left, and he drove his car back to the cathedral. And after hitting 4 or 5 cars in a massive heart attack, when they opened the door of his car, he had already gone to God. And I knew that when he was shaking hands with me, that he knew the heart attack was coming. I think part of it was due to the fact that Brian could never have stood being a patient in a hospital with pretty nurses looking after him and tending him. And he would have gone straight up to heaven out of that motor car, and I'm sure he did.
I would like to congratulate again the people of South Wagga on their anniversary. I would like to thank them sincerely for the many, many happy days they gave me, for the 6 happy years while I was there among them. I've never forgotten Wagga, could never forget it, and I wish to thank you sincerely for all that you did for me while I was there. God bless you all.
On behalf of all of us who were in the original youth group, I'd just like to congratulate South Wagga Catholic Parish on what has been, I'm sure, is 40 very successful years. I'd like to congratulate those people who contributed to this celebration and who have organised this anniversary, and also all the people who've been involved in all types of activities in that parish over this period. I'd like to wish you all the best of luck for your celebrations, and thank you very much for the opportunities I've had through the South Wagga Parish.
But I really did enjoy my time in South Wagga. I actually had another period there. After I came down to Albury for some years, I went off to the missions for a number of years, and I was ably supported when I was in New Guinea by the youth group that I had been part of when I was in South Wagga, and the other people that I helped care for. And after my years in New Guinea, when I returned, which was in 1974, I came back to South Wagga for 3 months to relieve there and renew old friendships and spend my time among the people that I cared for. And, you know, we played tennis, and we certainly did the Lord's work. We dispensed in the sacraments and we preached, but they were good formative years, and I'm very happy for the fact that South Wagga was such a part of my priesthood. And I wish everybody there every happiness and joy, and that your years ahead will be as fruitful as the years that have gone by. And thank you for making me and helping me to be the priest that I am today. For that I'll ever be grateful. So God bless you all.
I cannot conclude my memories of South Wagga Parish without acknowledging the love, the acceptance and the friendship that have been shown to me. Many people have walked with me during the ups and downs of my journey. They have celebrated with me, arranged surprise birthday parties, they have comforted me. They have supported me, challenged me, and loved me. When my parents decided to retire to Wagga, they determined to find a house in the South Wagga parish. As they said, it was a parish where people mattered. And that same feeling and situation still continues today. The parish and the school are the cogs and the wheels. They continue to inspire, to guide and to support. There is a strong faith dimension, a sense of down to earth, roll up your sleeves, help one another holiness. And I've been privileged to be part of it. Thank you.
I enjoyed being there, and I enjoyed the people. I think they're still hovering around in South Wagga, a lot of them, and they contributed an incredible amount to the life of the parish and the vitality of the parish. There was a great blend, I think, between people up there, and there was a great kind of sense of community, which I think was so very helpful to the parish in those days, as always is. And I think that to my mind was the great beauty of the parish, that everybody seemed to know who they were. They knew they were part of the parish. They were very mindful of a very deep spiritual base in the parish, which was based on prayer and their spiritual life and the Mass and the Eucharist, and yet it was all found expression in all these incredible activities that went on, including the Irish concerts and the over 40 concerts, and you name it. It was all that kind of social life welded together, and that was the great charisma, I suppose, of Father Brian Gall, who was able to kind of generate a lot of that, to offer the challenges in those areas, and then have people respond to those challenges.
So happy days, and when I go to heaven I shall meet so many of the marvellous people of Our Lady of Fatima, South Wagga, including Brian Gall, and all the happy memories will come back in abundance, I'm sure.